You will obey me.
Ah! No, please!
This is your lesson.
You are nothing. You were born to be nothing, and you will die having been exactly that.
The scream that tore through the manor walls that morning was not the kind anyone in the household dared acknowledge. It rose sharp and broken from behind the locked door at the end of the east corridor, and then it stopped, swallowed whole by silence the way all things were swallowed in the house of Lord Ambrogio Daluyapi. Inside that room, 19-year-old Suriya Daluyapi pressed herself into the corner of the stone wall, her palms flat against the cold, her breath coming in pieces. The blow had caught her across the cheek, the one before it had found her shoulder. She had learned long ago not to cover her face with her hands. Covering her face only made him angrier. "You are nothing," her father said, his voice low and measured now, the way it always grew quiet after the worst of it was done. "You were born to be nothing, and you will die having been exactly that." She did not cry. She had run out of tears sometime in her 14th year. What she did not know, what she could not have known, as she stood there with blood on her lip and bruises blooming beneath the collar of her dress, was that a carriage had just turned onto the road leading to Daluyapi Hall. That inside it sat a man who had not been invited, had not written ahead, and had not the faintest idea that the moment he stepped through those doors, everything was about to change, for her and for him. But that is the question, isn't it? What does a duke do when he sees wounds that were never meant to be seen? If you want to find out, make sure you are subscribed to this channel, because this story is only just beginning. Suriya had learned to move like a ghost through her own home. She kept her steps light, her eyes low, and her presence as small as possible in every room she entered. It was not timidity that had shaped her this way. It was survival. 19 years of living beneath the roof of Lord Ambrogio Daluyapi had taught her that to be noticed was to be punished, and to speak out of turn was to invite something far worse than silence. The morning after the incident in the East Corridor, she rose before the household stirred. She pulled on her plainest dress, the one with the high collar that sat snug against her neck, covering the darkening mark her father's grip had left the evening before. Her fingers worked the buttons slowly. Her left shoulder ached when she lifted her arm too high. She did not allow herself to dwell on it. The kitchen was empty when she slipped inside. She moved to the window and stood there for a long moment, watching the pale grey light spread itself across the grounds of Daluyapi Hall. The estate was beautiful in the way of a painting one could admire but never touch. Manicured hedgerows lined the gravel path. Stone urns framed the entrance steps, everything in its perfect, merciless place. Nothing about it felt like hers. She was pouring water into a small clay pot when she heard the housekeeper's footsteps on the flagstone corridor. Nena Buwan was a compact, careful woman of 50, with watchful eyes, and a habit of pressing her lips together before she spoke, as though every word required measuring first. She had served the Daluyapi household for 30 years. She had watched Suriya grow from an infant into this quiet, careful girl, and there were moments when the grief of that watching sat plainly on her face, though she never gave it a voice. She gave it no voice now either. She simply looked at Suriya's collar, then at the careful way the girl stood with her weight, shifted to her right side, and she turned to the hearth without a word. That was the language of this house. Everything spoken in the spaces between things. Suriya's mother had died when she was 4. She had no memory of her face, only of a particular warmth she associated with the color yellow, and she had never been entirely sure whether the memory was real or something she had invented to fill the hollow. Her father had never remarried. He had instead directed all the cold intensity of his nature toward the management of his estate, the preservation of his reputation, and the systematic diminishment of his only daughter. She did not know why he hated her. She had stopped asking the question by the time she was 12. Some doors, once you understood they would never open, were better left unexamined. What she did know was that she was to be presented at the Hardcastle Assembly in 3 days' time. Her father had announced it the week before, with the same tone he used to announce the rotation of crops. It was not an offer. It was a directive. She was to be dressed appropriately, to speak when addressed, and to conduct herself in a manner that reflected well on the Daluyapi name. The idea of it sat in her chest like a stone. She had attended one assembly before, 2 years prior, and had spent the better part of the evening standing near the wall while her father worked the room with the practiced ease of a man who wore cruelty only at home. She had smiled when smiled at. She had answered questions in as few words as possible. She had returned to Daluyapi Hall that night without having been seen by a single person in any way that mattered. She expected this time to be no different. She did not know that 3 days from now, a carriage bearing the crest of the Duke of Velsmore would roll to a stop outside those same assembly doors. She did not know that the man inside it had returned to the county after 4 years abroad, carrying his own particular weight of things that could not be spoken aloud. She did not know that he would look across a crowded room, past the silk and the candlelight, and the careful performances of 100 polished people, and find her standing at the wall, and she did not know what it would cost them both when he did. For now she only knew the sound of her father's boots on the upper floor, descending the stairs with slow, deliberate authority, and the way her entire body went still at the sound, the way it always did, the way it had done for as long as she could remember. She set down the clay pot. She straightened her collar. She waited. The assembly at Hardcastle was held in a room that smelled of beeswax candles, and too many people pressed together beneath low chandeliers. The light was warm and flattering to everyone except Suriya, who had arrived feeling like something that did not belong and had spent the first quarter hour confirming it. Her father stood near the far end of the room with a glass of wine and the company of Sir Renaldo Pugard, a widower of 53, with a red complexion and small, assessing eyes that had found Suriya twice already from across the room. She had felt both glances like a hand on her shoulder. She had not looked back. She stood near the wall beside a potted fern that had seen better years and watched the room move around her the way water moved around a stone. Couples turned on the floor. Mothers positioned daughters. Men laughed too loudly at things that were not funny. Everyone performing the same careful theatre and performing it well. Nina had dressed her hair that evening in a style simpler than fashion demanded, because Suriya had asked her to, because anything that drew attention felt like standing in an open field during a storm. Her gown was pale ivory, high-collared as always, and fit well enough that 2 young women near the refreshment table had glanced at her with something that might have been curiosity or might have been pity. She could not always tell the difference. She was reaching for a glass of water when she heard her father's voice cut through the noise behind her. "There she is, my daughter. As you can see, she is presentable enough." Presentable enough. Spoken in the same tone one used to describe furniture. She turned. Her father stood with Sir Rinaldo at his elbow, and the older man was looking at her with the particular focus of someone making a calculation. He smiled when their eyes met. It did not reach anything above his mouth. Miss Daluyapi, his voice was smooth in the way of things that had been worn down by long use. Your father speaks very highly of the match. The match. The word dropped into her chest and sat there cold and absolute. She looked at her father. His expression was pleasant, sociable, completely unreadable to anyone who did not know him. She knew him. Beneath the pleasant expression was a warning so familiar she could have described it with her eyes closed. She opened her mouth to say something careful and survivable. She never said it. The doors at the far end of the room opened, and the low murmur of conversation shifted in the way that rooms shift when something enters that was not expected. It was not a dramatic change. It was subtle, the way the air changes before weather arrives. Heads turned. A few whispers moved through the nearest cluster of guests like a small current. Suriya did not turn immediately. She was still looking at Sir Rinaldo's smile and trying to find somewhere inside herself to put the thing that was happening to her. Then she heard a name pass between two women standing close enough to be overheard. The Duke of Velsmore. She turned then. Everyone did, or nearly everyone, with the polished pretense of not doing so. He was taller than the men around him, not dramatically, but enough that her eye found him without effort. Dark-coated, unhurried, with the kind of stillness about him that did not come from ease, but from long practice at containing something. He was perhaps 30, perhaps a little beyond it. He had the look of a man who had seen enough of the world to be unimpressed by a room full of people trying to impress one another, and he wore that look without arrogance, which made it more unsettling than arrogance would have been. He spoke briefly to the man who had escorted him in, then lifted his gaze and let it move across the room with the calm, unhurried quality of someone who was looking for nothing in particular. It stopped on her, not on the room, not somewhere near her, on her. Suriya felt it the way one felt an unexpected cold draught in a warm room, a thing that arrived without invitation and could not immediately be explained. She looked away first. She looked back at Sir Rinaldo, who was still speaking, whose words she had entirely lost the thread of, and she pressed her hands flat against her skirt and told herself it meant nothing. Men looked at women in assembly rooms. It was the entire architecture of the evening. But when she glanced back, almost against her own intention, the Duke was still watching her, not with the measuring look Sir Rinaldo had used, not with the performative interest men wore when they wanted to be seen noticing someone. He was looking at her the way a person looked when something had genuinely caught their attention, and they had not yet decided what to do about it. Then his gaze dropped, just briefly, to her collar, to the place where the bruise sat beneath the ivory fabric, invisible to everyone in the room. Suriya's breath stopped. She did not know how he could see it. She did not know what he saw or what he thought he saw, but something shifted in the line of his expression, something quiet and sharp at once, and he looked back up at her face with an intensity that was entirely different from the look that had come before it. Her father's hand came to rest on her shoulder from behind, light and possessive, the way it always was in public. Suriya. His voice was pleasant. His fingers pressed down, just slightly, just enough. Stop standing there like a wall ornament. Sir Rinaldo is speaking to you. She turned back. She smiled. She said something appropriate. But she could feel the Duke's gaze still on the side of her face, steady and unmoving, like a question that had already been asked, and was simply waiting for the courage to be answered. She did not sleep that night. She lay in the dark of her room at Daluyapi Hall and stared at the ceiling and listened to the house settle around her, all its old familiar creaks and silences. And she thought about the way the Duke of Velsmore had looked at her collar. She told herself it was nothing. She was practiced at telling herself things were nothing. It was one of the more useful skills her father had given her, entirely without intending to. But the look had not been nothing. She had spent her whole life reading the faces of people who held power over her, learning to detect the smallest shift in expression before it became something she needed to survive, and she knew the difference between a man who had noticed a woman at an assembly and a man who had noticed something wrong. The Duke had noticed something wrong. The question that kept her awake was what he intended to do about it. The answer came sooner than she expected. He called at Daluyapi Hall the following morning. She heard the carriage from her room and went to the window out of habit, the way she always monitored arrivals and departures as a matter of self-preservation, and she recognized the crest on the door before the footman had finished descending the steps. Her stomach tightened. She stood very still and watched the Duke emerge from the carriage with the same unhurried composure he had worn the night before, and she thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that she was not ready for whatever this was. She was given no time to become ready. Her father received him in the front parlour with every performance of warmth and welcome that his considerable social skill could produce, and Suriya was sent for within 10 minutes, summoned by a housemaid with instructions to present herself appropriately. She checked her collar in the mirror before she left her room. She always checked her collar. The parlour was bright with morning light. Her father stood near the fireplace with a smile that did not waver. The Duke stood a few feet from him, and when Suriya entered, he turned toward her with an attention that was immediate and unguarded, in a way that made her profoundly uncomfortable, because she did not know what to do with being seen. "Miss Daluyapi," his voice was even, unhurried. "I hope I am not intruding." "Not at all," her father answered, before she could. He looked at her with the same quiet intensity from the previous evening, and she had the distinct and unnerving sense that he was cataloguing something, not her appearance. Not the way men catalogued women at assemblies, but something else. Something he was piecing together with care. "I came to inquire after the property of Morven Crossing," he said, directing the words at her father while keeping some portion of his attention on her. "I understand. You hold the eastern boundary lease." It was a reasonable thing to say, a perfectly ordinary reason to call. Her father accepted it without suspicion, shifted into the language of business and local landholding with the ease of a man who preferred those subjects to most others, and the conversation moved forward in a way that excluded Suriya entirely. She sat in the chair she was directed to and folded her hands in her lap and waited to be dismissed. The Duke did not dismiss her with his attention. He returned to her face. At intervals she became increasingly conscious of brief, deliberate glances that her father did not notice because her father rarely noticed anything that was not directly useful to him. Nina, who had brought the tea tray and lingered longer than was strictly necessary near the door, noticed. Suriya caught the older woman's eyes once and saw in them something she could not immediately name, something between warning and a fragile, careful hope. After 40 minutes, the Duke rose to leave. Her father walked him to the entrance hall. Suriya followed at the appropriate distance, present and invisible simultaneously, which was the role she had always performed. At the door, the Duke turned and addressed her directly for the first time since his arrival. "Miss Daluyapi," he said, I wonder if you might recommend a path along the eastern grounds. I intend to walk before the weather turns. Her father's smile held. His eyes did not change. But she felt the slight compression of attention in him. That particular stillness, that meant he was listening to everything. The lane past the lower garden is pleasant, she said carefully. It runs along the stone wall as far as the old yew. The Duke held her gaze for a moment longer than the exchange required. Thank you, he said quietly, and then even more quietly, so that only she could hear it beneath the ordinary noise of a departure. I intend to walk it at noon. Should anyone wish to take the air? He left. The door closed. Her father remarked that Velsmore seemed a sensible enough man for a duke and returned to his study. Suriya stood in the entrance hall alone and felt something shift inside her, something she had kept pressed flat. For so long she had nearly forgotten it had a name. It felt terrifyingly like the first small movement of hope. She went to the lane at noon. She told herself it was only for air. She told herself she was not going because of him, that the coincidence of the hour meant nothing, that she was simply a woman who had chosen to walk in her own garden at a time that happened to align with what a duke had said in a low voice at a doorway. She was very nearly convincing. The day was overcast, the sky, the colour of pewter pressing down over the grounds, and the lane past the lower garden was empty when she reached it. The stone wall ran along her left, old and moss-covered, the yew at its far end dark against the pale sky. She walked slowly. Her shoulder still ached. She kept her breathing measured and her hands clasped in front of her, and she looked at the ground, and she waited for the feeling of foolishness to arrive and send her back inside. Instead, she heard footsteps on the gravel behind her, and she turned. The Duke of Velsmore came along the lane at an unhurried pace, alone without the footman or attendant that rank and custom would ordinarily have demanded. He looked different outside the assembly room and the parlour, less contained, somehow, or perhaps more honestly contained, as though the open air permitted him an expression his face did not wear indoors. He stopped a proper distance from her and inclined his head. Miss Daluyapi. Your Grace. A silence opened between them, not an uncomfortable one, which itself made her uncomfortable, because silences with strangers were supposed to require filling, and this one simply existed between them, like something that had been there before. Either of them arrived. He spoke first. I am going to ask you something, he said, and I want you to know before I do that you are under no obligation to answer it, and that your answer will have no consequence either way. I give you my word on that. She looked at him steadily. She had learned to read the prefacing of questions, and this one did not have the shape of the questions she was usually asked. It did not want anything from her that she could immediately identify. Ask it, she said. The mark at your collar, he said. Was it your father? The ground did not move. The sky did not change. The yew at the end of the wall stood exactly as it had. And yet everything rearranged itself in the space of that question, because no one had ever asked it. Not Nina, who expressed her knowledge in other ways. Not the doctor, who had visited twice in the past 4 years, and had accepted the explanations offered without pressing further. No one had ever looked at her directly and asked the question that contained within it the acknowledgement that there was a question to be asked. She felt something crack open in her chest. She kept her face still. She meant to say nothing. She had years of practice saying nothing. The nothing rose in her throat exactly as it always did, practiced and protective and immediate. Yes, she said. She heard herself say it and felt the word leave her like something that had been held under water for a very long time, finally breaking the surface. She watched his expression. She was braced for pity, which she could not have borne, or for the particular discomfort men wore when confronted with things they wished. They had not asked about. Neither arrived. What arrived instead was a stillness in him that was not passivity. It was the stillness of a man who had just confirmed something he had already, decided to act on, and was now simply moving from confirmation to resolution. His jaw tightened once, briefly. His eyes did not leave her face. "How long?" he said. It was barely a question. It was the shape of one. "Always," she said. And the word cost her more than the first one had, because the first had only been a fact, and this one was the whole of her life compressed into a single syllable. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You are being presented to Sir Rinaldo Pugad." It was not a question either. "My father has indicated it is the direction he prefers," she said carefully. "And what direction do you prefer?" No one had asked her that either. The question was so foreign to the landscape of her existence that for a moment she genuinely did not know how to hold it. What she preferred, as though that were a real thing. As though her preferences were a category of information that existed and mattered and had somewhere to go. "It is not a question I have been permitted to answer," she said. Something moved through his expression then, something that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but carried the weight of both. "I would like to help you," he said. "I want to be clear about what I mean by that, because I imagine clarity is something you have not been offered much of. I do not mean in a way that costs you dignity or compounds your situation. I mean in a way that gives you a choice you do not currently have." She studied him. She had survived her entire life by accurately reading the motives of people who held power, and she brought every skill that survival had given her to bear on the man standing before her now. She looked for the angle, the hidden want, the thing underneath the words that would eventually become something she had to manage or endure. She could not find it. That frightened her more than if she had. "Why?" she asked. The word came out smaller than she intended, stripped of its careful armor. He held her gaze and answered without hesitation. "Because I know what it is to be trapped inside a life that was built around you without your consent," he said. "And because no one should carry what you are carrying alone." The wind moved through the yew at the end of the lane. She stood very still and felt the full, terrible weight of being understood by someone. For the first time in her life, and she did not know whether to run from it or hold on to it with both hands. She had 3 days before her father expected an answer about Sir Rinaldo, 3 days to decide whether she trusted the only person who had ever asked her what she wanted. She did not give him an answer that day in the lane. She walked back to the house alone as they had agreed she should, and she sat in her room as the afternoon light thinned and disappeared. And she turned the conversation over in her mind, the way one turned a stone, found unexpectedly on a familiar path, examining it from every angle, testing its weight, still not entirely certain it was real. The Duke had said he would return in 2 days. He had said it simply, without performance, the way a man stated a fact he intended to make true. He had not asked her to do anything in the meantime, except consider what she wanted. The instruction was so quiet and so entirely unlike anything anyone had ever said to her that she had to repeat it to herself 3 times on the walk, back before she could hold it without it dissolving. Consider what she wanted. She was still considering it when her father summoned her to his study that evening. He was seated behind his desk when she entered, the room lit by a single lamp that cast everything in amber and shadow. He did not look up immediately. He let her stand. It was something he did deliberately. The waiting, the silence, held just long enough to remind her of the precise distance between where he sat and where she stood. "Sir Rinaldo has made his interest formal," her father said, still not looking up from the papers before him. "He will call on Thursday. You will receive him properly, and you will conduct yourself in a manner that does not embarrass this family." "Yes, father." Now he looked up. His eyes moved over her face with the flat, assessing quality she had known her entire life, looking for resistance the way one looked for cracks in a wall. "Velsmore called this morning," he said. "I found it curious. Her pulse did not change. She had learned to keep her pulse from changing. He mentioned the eastern boundary lease," she said. "He did." Her father's gaze held. "He also asked a number of questions about you that a man interested only in a property lease does not typically ask." She said nothing. Saying nothing was almost always the correct answer. "You will not encourage it," her father said. His voice was pleasant. The pleasantness was the most dangerous register he possessed. "Whatever you imagine is happening, it is not happening. Men like Velsmore do not come for women like you. If he is paying you attention, it is because he finds it amusing, and when he is finished finding it amusing, he will move on, and you will have made yourself a fool in front of the entire county and taken this family's name down with you." He paused. "Do you understand me?" "Yes, father," she said. He looked at her for one moment longer, then returned to his papers. She was dismissed without being told she was dismissed, which was also something she had always known how to read. She left the study and walked upstairs, and stood in the corridor outside her room, with her back against the wall and her eyes closed, and she let herself feel for exactly 30 seconds everything she was not permitted to feel in front of him. The anger, the exhaustion so deep it had roots, the grief of being 19 years old and already worn to the bone by a life she had never chosen. Then she opened her eyes. Something had changed in the past 2 days, and she was only now allowing herself to name it. It was not the Duke himself, not exactly. It was what he had done, which was to stand in a lane and ask her 2 questions no one had ever asked, and listen to her answers without flinching, without looking away, without making her feel that the truth of her life was something to be managed or minimized or quietly set aside. He had held it. He had held all of it without dropping it, and that single fact had done something irreversible to the architecture of her resignation. She had spent 19 years believing that what was happening to her was simply what happened, that it was the fixed condition of her existence. And the only sane response to a fixed condition was endurance. The Duke had not argued with that. He had simply asked her what she wanted, as though the answer were a thing that could exist, and in doing so had made it true. On Thursday morning, 2 hours before Sir Rinaldo was due to call, a letter arrived addressed to Lord Daluyapi in a hand Suriya did not recognize. She was crossing the entrance hall when Nena brought it in from the door, and she would not have given it a second glance except that she caught the small seal pressed into the wax. The crest of Velsmore. Her father was in the letter for a long time. When he emerged from his study, his face was composed in the way it was composed when something had occurred that he had not anticipated and was still deciding how to respond to. He looked at Suriya standing in the corridor and said nothing. He went to the front parlour and closed the door. An hour later, Sir Rinaldo's carriage arrived and left again within 20 minutes, without Sir Rinaldo having come inside at all. Nena found Suriya in the kitchen and stood beside her at the window, and they both watched the carriage disappear down the road. The older woman was quiet for a long time. Then she reached out and placed her hand briefly over Suriya's, just once, just for a moment. "Something is shifting," Nena said softly. Suriya looked at the empty road where the carriage had been, She thought about a man who had walked a lane at noon and asked a question that had never been asked before. She thought about what it had cost her to answer it, and what it might yet cost her still. Because her father's silence was never the end of something. It was always the beginning of something worse. But beneath the fear, steady and unfamiliar, and refusing now to be pressed flat, was something else entirely. She was no longer willing to simply endure, and that, she understood, changed everything. Her father did not speak to her for 3 days after Sir Rinaldo's carriage left it without stopping. The silence was not unusual in its texture. It was the specific silence he employed when he was recalculating, when something had moved outside his control, and he was quietly, methodically working out how to bring it back inside it. Suriya had lived inside that silence enough times to know its shape. She knew it would end. She knew what it usually sounded like when it did. What was different this time was that she was not waiting for it, with her whole body braced. The Duke's letter had said nothing she was permitted to know about. Her father had not told her its contents, and she had not asked, because asking would have told him more than she was willing to give him. But Sir Rinaldo had not come inside, and that absence had the weight and significance of a spoken sentence. And she understood, without being told, that something had been placed between her and that particular future. On the 4th day, a second letter arrived. This one was addressed to her. She took it from Naina's hands in the upstairs corridor before her father could see it, and she carried it to her room and sat on the edge of her bed and held it for a long moment before she opened it. Her name on the outside was written in the same hand as the seal she had recognized before, measured, unhurried, certain of itself. Inside, the letter was brief. He wrote that he had no wish to replace one constraint with another. He wrote that what he wanted to offer her was not rescue, in the way the word was usually meant, not a transaction, not a shelter that came with conditions she had not agreed to. He wrote that there was a cottage on the Velsmore estate in the north that sat empty, managed by a woman of good standing who had served his family for decades, and that it was hers if she chose it, no obligation attached, no expectation of anything in return. He wrote that if she decided to stay, he would respect that. He wrote that if she decided to go, a carriage would come at whatever hour she named. At the bottom, in the same steady hand, he had written one final line. "You are allowed to want something. I hope you will let yourself." She read it twice, then she folded it carefully and held it in both hands and looked at the window and the pale morning sky beyond it, and she thought about the girl she had been at 14, at 12, at 7. All the versions of herself that had learned progressively smaller ways to exist inside this house, and she felt something in her chest that was not quite grief and not quite relief, but contained elements of both. The particular feeling of a door opening that you had stopped believing was a door. She heard her father's boots on the stairs. She did not press herself flat against the wall. She did not still her breathing or compose her face into careful blankness. She stood up from the edge of the bed, and she folded the letter and placed it inside the cover of the book on her nightstand, and she turned to face the door, and she waited, and the waiting was entirely different from every other time she had waited, because this time she was not waiting out of helplessness. She was waiting because she had not yet decided, and for the first time in her life, the decision was hers to make. Her father opened the door without knocking, as he always did, and stood in the frame, and looked at her with the familiar assessing quality, searching for the crack. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said that she would be attending the Pembury dinner on Friday, and that she would conduct herself appropriately, and that whatever ideas she had developed, Recently she would be wise to set aside before they led her somewhere she could not return from. She looked at him. She really looked at him, perhaps more directly than she ever had, and she saw what she had always known, but never allowed herself to hold at full clarity. He was not going to change. He was not capable of it. The cruelty was not a mood or a season. It was the fixed architecture of who he was, and she had spent 19 years trying to survive inside it, and she could spend 19 more, or she could choose the door. She said, "Yes, Father," in the tone she had always used. He left. She stood in the quiet room and listened to his footsteps recede down the corridor, and she reached for the letter inside the book cover, and she held it, and she thought about Elaine and a noon hour and a man who had asked her what she wanted without wanting anything back. She thought about Nena, who had watched and said nothing for 30 years because there had been nothing to say, and she thought about what it would mean to leave, and what it would cost her to stay. Outside the window, the road that led away from Daluyapi Hall stretched pale and quiet through the morning light. She looked at it for a long time, and then, with hands that were steady in a way they had never quite been before, she made her choice. What would you have done, standing in that room, holding that letter, with the road right there in front of you? Sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is simply believe that they deserve something better. If this story moved something in you today, please subscribe to this channel. There is so much more coming, and every single story we tell is made for you.